Another update, another set of complaints. Ninja Kiwi released the 33.0 update not too long ago, and there's some changes here that are questionable. I already feel so spoiled just saying that. Coming from communities that don't expect any balance updates to their games, what Ninja Kiwi does is really special. I don't want to complain about the work they're putting in to make the game that much closer to perfection. However, I also don't want their work to create more distance between their game and perfection. The new restriction to Paragons is how many of them you can have on screen at a time. That limit is 3, and this applies to all game modes, including bosses in free play. And that's a big concern, because some boss events are already tough enough as is. I know that bosses are supposed to be difficult. You're supposed to farm as hard as you can and then spend as much as you can to deal the best damage. But Vortex in particular has had a lot of nasty weeks. The most recent of which actually did have a 3 Paragon maximum, and doing 4-player elite in that mode was borderline impossible, despite playing perfectly for 3 tiers, all because of one blunder getting a Monkeyopolis early. I probably just sound salty, but let me explain myself. First of all, we won, and that run ended up being 4th place anyways. But the rules should not cater specifically to top level gameplay. If someone wants to take their time to farm more and not sweat over insta-killing every boss tier, they have normal mode for that. Players in elite mode are forced to sweat harder. That isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it sounds perfectly in line with what an elite difficulty should be. But just how sweaty is enough? The thing is, ranked mode automatically gives you the ability to customize the difficulty of the boss. It's no longer just about winning. Ranked mode gives you a penalty for beating rounds too slowly, and for every millisecond that the boss is on screen. So you have to be as efficient as possible to get the best possible time. But maybe you don't want to sweat that hard to do better than anyone else. Maybe you just want to do good enough to get top 50. That's when you have to study the game really hard and use meta strategies. Maybe you want to try for a top 3 medal. Depending on the competition and the boss rules, that could take hours and hours of trial and error, experimenting with the best gameplay strategies. And from there, you can always take it further to try for first place. Point is, simply earning the elite medal at all is up to Ninja Kiwi's design and the player's skill and dedication. But earning a place in the leaderboards introduces an almost infinite spectrum of difficulty. So if the minimum difficulty, which is earning the medal at all, is pushed up on the difficulty spectrum, all this does is shrink the amount of players enjoying the event. Of course, if it's too easy, it takes the fun out of earning the medal at all, and some people will not want to increase the difficulty on their own by trying ranked mode. So instead, their experience on an easy boss event could be summarized as them earning the medal and then feeling a bit disappointed with what they consider an anticlimax. Now compare that experience to a player putting their all into the elite event, yet still coming up short after hours of trying because it was too difficult. The player that goes through the latter will likely be far less happy than the player in the former situation. So is it better to try to prevent this experience from happening to more players at the risk of an anticlimax for other players? This is a discussion that could go on and on about difficulty in video games. But with the sheer number of posts online about how brutal the boss rules are for some events, it does seem like easing back a bit would be the way to go. More people will actually enjoy beating the boss if this happens. While it does mean more people can potentially feel an anticlimax from beating it too easily, all of these people are still able to go to ranked mode and increase the difficulty that way. Ranked mode, like I said before, has a nigh infinite spectrum of difficulty. If beating the boss alone isn't hard enough, then maybe beating the boss in less than 10 minutes will be sufficiently challenging. They can even try self-imposed restrictions, like not removing any of the coordinate cornfield, just to make the boss more interesting. If they just choose not to up the ante with ranked mode, that is them choosing not to engage with a feature in the game, and therefore, not necessarily the game's fault or responsibility to try to fix it. As with self-imposed challenges, that's something that even the best of the best players can always do to spice things up. But instead, the game is undermining all of that by making ranked mode less diverse. Less Paragons at once means less good options to choose from for a boss battle. I think this is harmful to all parties here. For the better players, they have less reason to farm as hard because now there is an artificial cap on the most significant boss options. Top 3 runs are just going to belong to the people who bother to spam the most snipers, plasma accelerators, summon phoenixes, overdrives, sun avatars, and whatever other tower you want. We already see this happen in boss events, where the Paragons were artificially restricted with crosspath and tower bans. The fight is more linear when you only have a few truly good options to choose from. You obviously want to get a Paragon, so when the only Paragons allowed are a select 2 or 3, then of course you're going to get those ones. Meanwhile, the less advanced players have less big things to spend money on because they have less Paragons available. So there's less reason to farm harder to be able to afford 4 or more Paragons plus a VTSG. Instead, you just have to make sure you can afford whatever is good enough to get the job done. The 3 Paragon limit is effectively a global restriction that limits the fun for everyone. Casual players now have less solutions to a tough boss because they can't throw more Paragons at it. Advanced players are just going to have to spam more with the money they farm, instead of putting it into something more effective. And to top it all off, to me it ruins what the fun of bosses was to begin with, the scale of it all. When Bloonarius was first released, I loved that we were forced to find ways to farm well enough that we could afford defenses for every tier, and the higher tiers were so strong that we needed to throw everything we had at the boss. The experience of working hard to farm so that I could then earn these Paragons in tier 5s was so satisfying. I had a huge damage sponge to throw all this firepower at. It was rewarding. It was cathartic. With a limit, I can't even experience what it would feel like to use the maximum possible firepower against a boss. I would love to be given enough of a farming head start to afford all 6 Paragons plus a super buffed VTSG against a boss with tens of millions of HP. But knowing that I can only have about half of that at most makes every boss fight sort of bittersweet. I can no longer make my power fantasy into a reality, and I think that defeats the fundamental purpose of this video game, to be fun. That's why this restriction even bleeds into free play, where it has no business keeping people from having fun in a mode that only affects them. At least the boss events are a competitive environment when you select ranked mode, but free play should be people's own sandbox to play in. If there's one upside to this, it means there might be more cool features for Paragons going forward. If you can't have more than 3 Paragons when going into epic late game, that's probably because Ninja Kiwi is trying to prevent free play from becoming an insta-kill spam fest. The Navark opened the doors for this with its hook that works on bats. Anything is on the table now. So, maybe Paragons will get more cool abilities and ways to be used to pop balloons effectively. Microwaving the Ace Paragon's bombs is really fun and rewarding, so this is a step in the right direction design-wise. While the Engineer Paragon is disappointing with how it represents the most iconic and significant parts of its parent tower, it does at least have a cool playstyle of using the Mega Sentry explosions to delete bosses. I think that is what Ninja Kiwi is going for with all of this. The last thing they want is for the game to become too linear. That's why they focused so much on balancing every crosspath of every tower, and making each upgrade stand on its own without being overshadowed by another. There should be no meta, only towers being more effective at their specific purpose, and each purpose being useful in its own way. However, I think the last few changes to the game are going backwards on this mission. In the last update, the Monkeyopolis was nerfed so hard that it has no utility other than saving space. It went from $300 per $2,000 to $200 per $2,000, and while that ratio is a clean 1 to 10, I think a middle ground of $250 per 2,000 or something else would have worked better. It would add more to think about when deciding how to farm. Should you upgrade the tower with fewer sacrifices and start earning more efficiently sooner? Or should you wait for more sacrifices first so that efficiency is applied to a larger number? From what I can tell, the last thing Ninja Kiwi wants is for tower choices to become linear. But that's exactly what they did with the Monkeyopolis. You get it once you're out of space for research facilities, and then rebuild the facilities. There isn't much more thought to it than that. None of this so far covers the problem with Paragons having a clear-cut meta between them. If you can only get a limited number of Paragons, players will opt for the ones that best get the job done, and so far it's really obvious which ones are the best. A huge part of this meta problem arises from how degrees work. No matter how many times Ninja Kiwi nerfs the Dart Paragon or buffs the Boomerang Paragon, the Dart will always be better in single player. This is because you can get an extra 5th tier tower in the Crossbow Master. Whether or not they patch the bug it has on the Paragon, getting it to degree 30 or just 20 should always be stronger than a degree 1 Paragon. If it isn't, then the Dart Paragon has simply become underpowered. Degrees should matter enough for this difference to always make the choice obvious. I specified that this problem only exists in single player, and that's because you can get more tier 5s of any tower in co-op. That's when the Boomerang Paragon gets to shine, because you can build more Glaive Lords and Permacharges to easily get to the 40s or even 60s. Spamming Ultra Juggernauts is still a really effective co-op option because of how cheap that 5th tier is, but I'd say the Boomerang outclasses the Dart Paragon in co-op most of the time nonetheless. It's just that the Monkey Knowledge for a second Crossbow Master completely eclipses the Glaive Dominus' utility beneath the Apex Plasma Master. The best solution I can think of for this that doesn't just completely rework the Paragon degree system is to change the Monkey Knowledge point. Make it so that you can get more than one tier 5 of any tower of your choice, but only one more. That way, you can intentionally spec into whichever Paragon you wish to use. Another option is to use the remaining Monkey Knowledge points that players can't spend to create a new tree for Paragons, or at least a new branch or a couple of branches that can be used to change up the meta. I don't want to come up with all of the ideas for Ninja Kiwi, especially since, sometimes, making suggestions actually makes it harder for game companies to use those ideas in the future. At least, that's what I've heard from other developers. These problems are so specific that they only cover a small portion of the game and an even smaller portion of the community, I know. But I think it's an interesting topic of discussion. Game design, and in particular what makes something fun, are topics I love to dig deeper into. So, I'm highly curious to know what other people think of any and everything that's been discussed here. Please, let me know if you agree with me about the Paragon limit and what ideas you have to solve the Paragon meta. After all, the last thing I'd want for this conversation is for it to be limited.